So today we are going to be talking about supernatural occurrences. Specifically, we are going to be reacting to a debate between Alex O'Connor and Trent Horn. Alex O'Connor is more of a skeptic of supernatural occurrences, and he's going to be talking about the Bible and the Mormon church and supernatural occurrences that led to people believing in incredible things like Jesus rising from the dead or Joseph Smith getting the golden tablets, and how those sort of snowballed into large-scale religions that exist within society. Their foundations are on these supernatural occurrences. And what evidence do we have for them actually occurring? Is the evidence strong or weak? They are going to be debating that.
I've noticed, like in the past 10 years, I've studied a lot between, two groups that often debate this. You'll have skeptics on one side, like Alex, or previously debates, like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. And then you have a lot of evangelical apologists, people like William Lane Craig and Mike Licona. And one thing I've noticed that they both kind of have in common is they're very skeptical towards non-Protestant supernatural things. So what will happen in these situations, I've seen Bart Ehrman, I've seen others say.
So basically what he's talking about is he's referencing often religious scholars will be very skeptical of supernatural occurrences outside of the Christian religion, because obviously in Christianity and a lot of other religions, there are supernatural occurrences in those religious texts, such as Jesus rising from the dead or even appearing after his death to a bunch of people. In other religions, this happens a lot as well. But people who are religious tend to be very dismissive of other supernatural occurrences that are outside of their religious faith.
Why don't you believe in these, groups of people say that they saw the Virgin Mary at Fatima or the Virgin Mary at Zaytun, Egypt? Right. We even have photographs of this apparition that has appeared, that hundreds of thousands of people saw this illuminated figure at Zaytun. Travis Doomsday did a whole academic book that recently on the Zaytun apparition, and he finds it inexplicable. Dale Allison, who I know you spoke with recently, Alex,
yes,
he finds it just inexplicable, because even the Egyptian authorities shut off the electricity to the area, and yet this illuminated figure that looks a lot like the Virgin Mary still appeared. So for me, I take more middle ground saying, yeah, I think that was a supernatural event. And also I think these other events like Fatima or Zaytun, for me, they lend evidence to Jesus's resurrection, because if Jesus did rise from the dead, these appearances of his mother would not be unexpected. I'd expect a son to take care of his mom, take her up to heaven, and she might go talk to the faithful. But if Jesus did not rise from the dead, these sorts of apparitions and appearances would be very unexpected. So I'm open more so that there's many strange and odd things that happen. Some of them can be explained naturally, but many I don't think can.
Right now would be a good time to reference the God of the gaps, that anything you can't explain, you can attribute to God. And this is something that's been shown throughout history, that a lot of scholars and, a lot of scientists even will get to a point where they can't explain things with science, and the things that they cannot explain, they attribute it to God. And very respectable scientists throughout history have been able to do this. I believe like Isaac Newton, I believe even Einstein has used God of the gaps at certain points. And I think that that's something that this guy is doing right now, is he's looking at things that he cannot explain, that nobody can explain, and he is saying that it's supernatural. It not necessarily has to be God, but people believe that certain things that they can't explain, that human beings have not been able to explain yet, are supernatural, and they cannot be explained through science, and they cannot be explained through the physical realm that we see before us today. It's interesting because you cannot really disprove that. If nobody can explain something, there's no way for you to say that, oh, it's not God. But in the same token, there's no evidence for it being supernatural. Just because you don't know how to explain something, you can't say, well, the explanation is this, that is something supernatural, because that is just as weak as any other explanation you could have for it. I think it's much richer to just say that you don't have the ability to explain it now and leave it at that. There doesn't need to be a reference to something supernatural or otherwise.
We shouldn't necessarily rush to supernatural explanations, but we should see which explanation best accounts for everything without cramming the evidence, without bringing in outside ad hoc explanations. And I think Jesus rising from the dead really does do a good job of explaining a lot of the data surrounding Jesus' resurrection, but also these other supernatural events throughout history that are connected to the Christian faith. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Alex, I was recently hosting your tour across the UK, an evening with Alex O'Connor, and so many people wanted to find out about what you thought about apparitions. I don't know if that's something you've looked into a lot, or what do you make of this kind of additional case for the resurrection?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because a lot of the time when arguing with a Protestant, you can say something like, well, then how do you explain the Marian apparitions? And with a Catholic, that doesn't quite fly. I suppose I have a general suspicion of these kinds of religious events. And that's not to say that they didn't happen, but to say that insofar as concerns my faith in the resurrected Jesus, they don't do very much. And I can tell you why. It's because I don't think that such experiences are unique to the Christian tradition. Although sort of the experience of a bodily risen Christ by multiple people all at once is definitely something that would be unique in history. You don't get group hallucinations of that kind of physical kind. There are a few things I want to say. Firstly, you do have inexplicable group visions of, I think, equally inexplicable events, which I'll give you some examples of. And secondly, I'm actually not quite sure of the nature of the resurrected Jesus as reported in the Gospels. There seems to be at least a bit of a back and forth amongst the Gospel authors and within Paul's letters as to the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, leading some scholars to posit things such as trans-physicality and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so when you talk about Jesus being resurrected and appearing before 500 people, if somebody said that to you at face value and they were like, yeah, the Bible says that there are 500 people who saw Jesus after his death, after he has been resurrected from the dead. That's how they knew he was resurrected from the dead, is because 500 people saw him. At face value, that's like, wow, that's kind of a lot of eyewitness testimony. But when you dig into that a little bit further, you notice that, okay, it's just somebody saying that 500 people saw him after his death. It's not actually 500 witnesses coming forth and each giving a vivid description about what happened. It's literally the author saying, the author of that book in the Bible, I guess it was Paul, since that's who he's referencing, who said that 500 people after Jesus' death saw him appear before them. And if we were able to do that in modern times and we were able to actually interview these people, maybe we could get to the bottom of this, and maybe we would find that they did see Jesus because they gave very accurate accounts of what happened and they were all on sort of the same page about what happened. That would be a lot better evidence, but it is some evidence if you have 500 eyewitnesses that would be pretty difficult to explain. But the 500 eyewitnesses that they had, they're not named and they're not referenced more than a little blip of the Bible. And there are some eyewitnesses from the Bible who are named. You know, he appeared to some of the apostles, if not all. I don't know for sure. Though they are named, but even then, like, these eyewitnesses are being referenced decades, if not like more than 100 years after this event took place. And if you're describing an event that took place decades ago, and when you weren't there yourself, you're referencing eyewitnesses who you aren't able to interact with, that doesn't provide any strong evidence about what happened or what they may have seen.
To explain why at some points it seems like Jesus is this ghostly figure who tells people not to touch him and can move through walls, and how Paul says that flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom, and all of this kind of stuff, and 2 Peter talking about how he has this tent of a body that he will one day get rid of, as we've seen Christ essentially do. But at the same time, you have these, I think, polemical moments of Jesus saying, no, like, touch my feet, watch me eat some fish. Which seems like a sort of odd thing to prioritize. Unless you want to say that the glorified, resurrected body gets hungry very easily. It seems strange that one of the first priorities of Jesus would be, give me the fish so I can eat it in front of you and prove that I'm physical. It would seem a little bit strange. On the point of sort of group hallucinations, as it were, I don't know if these things occur. What I know is that we've got lots of reports throughout history of people claiming to see some very strange things. I like to talk about Mormonism, and I like to do it for a few reasons. Firstly, because it usually offers a bit of a sort of left field comparison for Christians, but also in this context, I know that Trent has spent a lot of time looking into Mormonism and debating Mormonism. I would like to tell people, for example, that if you pick up any copy of the Book of Mormon, it always begins with testimonies from first the 3 witnesses and then secondly the 8 witnesses. And these are men who claimed to see, in the first instance, Joseph Smith, the golden plates of Joseph Smith be handed by an angel to Joseph Smith. Now, those first 3 witnesses claimed that they saw this. Now, it's a little bit complicated because it's like 2 of them saw it at the same time and then 1 of them saw it later. And you might say that he was hallucinating, but I would say, how do you account for the corroboration between that and the other 2? At the very least, these men who claimed to see something, again, collectively, which I don't think Trent can grant happened. I don't think he can grant that an angel gave Joseph Smith the golden plates. And yet, they claim to have seen this. And there's something extra here that you don't get in the Christian tradition, which is that it's kind of a reverse Paul. People often say, well, Paul used to persecute Christians, so why would he see this vision? This is the other way around, and I think therefore stronger. All 3 of these men were eventually excommunicated from the Mormon church. They fell out with Joseph Smith, and they were excommunicated from the church, yet until the day of their death, they asserted that they had seen the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so yeah, this is very interesting. Like, you look at a case of the Mormon Church and you have more recent and credible, if you will, testimonies from people saying that Joseph Smith was given the Mormon religious text by an angel or whatever. If you are very likely to trust those testimonies from people who saw Jesus rising from the dead, then you should also trust, just as equally, if not more so, the Mormon Church and the foundations of the Mormon Church. But I think at the root of this is, why do you trust people so much based on their word without any actual evidence? So like a lot of these religions and a lot of these superstitious beliefs or supernatural beliefs that occur in the world come from trust in people or trust in our senses, and which have been proven throughout history to be very fickle. Our senses are very fickle compared to what we are able to prove scientifically, what we are able to reproduce through scientific experiments. Why would you put your trust in people's word when, throughout history, people have exaggerated the truth, they have lied? It's something that happens every day in society. There's certain a big part of their everyday job is to lie or exaggerate the truth. If you're doing sales, like maybe you're not necessarily lying, but you're supposed to exaggerate and manipulate people to believe what you believe. I just don't see why people would put so much trust in the word of others when what they're claiming is so extraordinary. It's not like they're just saying, oh, I had a sandwich for lunch, believe me. They're claiming something very extraordinary. You should have extraordinary evidence to support that.
As Trent knows, Martin Harris is said to have sort of seen the plates with his spiritual eyes. So I'm attempting to draw an analogy here, right? So Martin Harris is one of the 3 witnesses, the other being Oliver Cowdery and David Whitman. And in 1838, Stephen Burnett claims that Martin Harris didn't see it with his natural eyes, but that it was a kind of vision. But then Martin Harris later said, look, as surely as I see my hands, I saw the golden plates. What I want to point out is that there are analogues here, which is that you've got this sort of claim of group appearances, which seem a little bit strange. You've got this kind of reason why maybe they wouldn't want to make this claim. And then you've got this slight debate over, well, was it physical? Was it spiritual? We're not entirely sure. Yeah. People often talk about the persecution of the apostles. So when I bring up the Mormon church, people say, oh yeah, but you don't understand that Christians were persecuted. They were put to death by Nero and Diocletian. And I'm like, have you looked into Mormon history? Do you not know that in the lifetimes of these witnesses and other witnesses to Mormon miracles, Mormons were persecuted by the United States of America? There was the Mormon Extermination Act in Missouri, which literally called for the extermination and expulsion of Mormons. They were chased out of basically every state that they went into. In other words, I'd like to know how we explain that. There's then the 8 witnesses who don't witness the angel, but they do witness the golden plates. 8 of them who, again, 3 of those guys also lose touch with the Mormon church, fall out with Joseph Smith and get excommunicated, but still attest that that's what they saw. More to the point, though, there's this extraordinary event which I found when I was researching the history of the Mormon church a while ago, which is a transfiguration event. It's absolutely extraordinary. So in 1844, I'm sure Trent will be familiar with this. In 1844, there was something of a succession crisis, right? Joseph Smith had died and they didn't know who was going to be the next leader. So they called a conference in August, on the 8th of August. Brigham Young is one of the speakers. Now, we know from Brigham Young's later diaries that he says that there were thousands of people present. He says there were thousands of people at this conference. So let's say there were at least a few hundred. And amazingly, George Cannon writes in 1870, which is just 26 years later, that Brigham Young, while speaking, that vying for the leadership, transfigures into the image and likeness and voice of Joseph Smith. He says, who that was present on that occasion can ever forget the impression it made upon them? If Joseph had risen from the dead and spoken in their hearing, the effect could not have been more startling than it was to many present at that meeting. So we've got this report of probably hundreds of people seeing quite a miraculous event. Now, you could say, well, that report comes 26 years later. Okay, and how much later were Paul's reports? How much later were the gospel reports?
Much older.
Also note that in 1857, which is just 13 years after this event, after the Transfiguration, you have Albert Carrington's experience.
Even if the reports are in real time, even if they're a week later or a day later, those reports you would be very skeptical of something. If you're not skeptical of certain other religions, a lot of people tend to be very skeptical of the Mormon religion, even though the evidence for it isn't much weaker than like other religions out there. You have these eyewitness testimonies of miracles like this. So even if you saw it the day after, I know most people would be very skeptical of it. If you were to apply that same skepticism to some other religions or seeing a ghost, for example, you'd be like, okay, you know what, maybe there's another explanation for this. Even though I don't have that explanation, I'm not going to rush to my own explanation and point to the supernatural. Maybe some people at the conference felt like they saw Brigham Young turn into the likeness of Joseph Smith, and then maybe even just one person saw it and then told somebody else about that. And if you're already in this like spiritual state, you're going to be very impressionable by somebody saying, oh yes, I saw him turn into the likeness of Joseph Smith. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what I was feeling too. You know what? I saw it too. And a lot of people who are in that space of spirituality and they're already attached to these Mormon beliefs, they might be more inclined to say that that's what they felt at that conference or that's what they saw at that conference. And you can see that like there's a snowball effect of trying to get on the same page because there's so much weight attached to their belief of that Mormon religion.
Brigham Young recounts Albert Carrington's experience and says that Carrington says that people could not tell him from Joseph Smith and could not see anyone but Joseph speaking. What you'll notice is that there's still this evidence that there's some kind of transfigurative event, but much less detailed, but much more close to the source. In 1869, 25 years later, so somewhere in the middle, Orson Hyde, who was an early Mormon leader, confirms the event, saying it was the voice of Joseph and there were the features, gestures, and even the stature of Joseph. So what we have are three independent, in one case, eyewitness account, because Orson Hyde was actually speaking on the same day at the conference, eyewitness accounts of a transfiguration of Brigham Young in front of hundreds of witnesses, many of whom, in the words of George Cannon, he says, who was present on that occasion that could ever forget this? In other words, if you're in any doubt about this, you could go and ask the witnesses who were there. Now, shelve that for a moment and think about how people talk about things like Trent's already mentioned the appearances that Paul recounts in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says that Jesus appeared to Peter, which is strange because we don't get that narrated in the gospel stories, even though that seems to be the first and most important. But I mean, most pressingly, Paul says that Jesus appears to 500 people, as above 500 people, probably more than possibly above in a visionary experience. That's something else. And people say, look, this is our only source. But, Paul says some of these people are still alive. So if you're in any doubt, you could just go and ask them. And I would say, well, why didn't people go and ask about the Mormon transfiguration experiences? Perhaps because if you read George Q. Cannon's account, it's not clear who these people are. I mean, people often say this. They say, those 500 people, some of them were still alive, so you could have gone and checked. How? You're just going to walk to Jerusalem, which has tens of thousands of people at minimum in it, and just start asking around and see if anyone's seen the risen Christ? How many no's would it take before you said, okay, maybe not then? In other words, I have no idea why Paul says that Jesus appeared to 500 people. We don't know that Paul was there. He probably wasn't. He says he's passing down something that was passed on to him, which says that it's an early creed. But we're not quite sure where that creed ends, because Paul inserts himself at the end of it. But we don't know where he's heard it from. We don't know who these 500 people are. We don't know why they were gathered. We don't know how many of them believed. We don't know if any of them recounted. We don't know anything about this kind of event. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that compared to something like the events of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young, from someone outside of all of this, who has no vested interest here really, I see them as equally plausible, perhaps more plausible in the case of Mormonism, because that happened in the 1800s, and we have at least one eyewitness account that says that he saw it directly. We don't have anything like that for the Gospels. The only eyewitness account that we have for the resurrection of Jesus, the only one, is Paul, who did not see a bodily resurrected Christ, but saw a flash in the sky and heard a voice, which is not the same kind of thing.
So they're not even on the same page about what they saw and what the resurrection meant to them. So the one eyewitness that we had, which was Paul, saw a very different form of resurrection than the eyewitnesses that he described. So they're not even on the same page. And if you have multiple eyewitnesses who are not on the same page, it diminishes the value of their eyewitness testimony, because there's not one single truth there. Now, it is possible that Jesus appeared in multiple different forms, but if you're able to shift the narrative from he physically rose from the dead to, well, people saw certain things that reminded them of Jesus, and everybody sort of saw something in their own way, saying that he rose from the dead means something entirely different than what most people believe it to mean, which is that he physically rose from the dead, or he at least presented himself in a spiritual form. But if that spiritual form is not consistent, then it's you're going to be a little bit more skeptical naturally.
Many skeptics, when they look at Christians, are probably saying, let's make sure we're on the same page here. Look, if you're going to follow evidence, that's all fine and dandy, but I want to see that you are following it consistently.
Yes.
If you're carving out special exceptions for what you believe, and then you're dismissive of all the other stuff, well, now you see where I'm coming from. So I think that's the challenge in defense. I think that's, at least I'm seeing that more now. The challenge is, all right, let's follow your standards of evidence that will only show Jesus' resurrection and Christian miracles, but not necessarily non-Christian things.
Yes.
Although I will, is that a fair summary of that?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay. So my reply then, and I think this is getting back to what I said earlier about evangelical apologists that have frequently engaged in this, or other Christians. There are some Christians who hold to a view that's called, in Christian theology, is a debate between cessationism and continuationism. Do divine charisms, do miracles happen after the apostolic age?
Yep.
And there are some Christians who say, no, that's all frauds. The miracles ended with the death of the apostles. And then there are more Pentecostal Christians who say, well, no, God still performs miracles. And as a Catholic, we're certainly continuationists. We have saints that have been proclaimed to do all kinds of different miracles. And I would say with pretty good evidence behind several of them. So we would say, well, no, there's no reason to shut that off. So I think that some people who defend the resurrection, they're very, very skeptical of paranormal or post-apostolic miracles when they shouldn't be. Now, I don't believe all of them. I think some have bad evidence for them or insufficient evidence. Likewise, when it comes to non-Christian religions, I think that God could perform miracles or signs or wonders among non-Christians, and that could still be harmonious with Christian theology.
Yeah, that's one thing that I struggled with when I was Christian growing up, is that I didn't understand why there's so many miracles in the Bible, but there weren't any miracles in modern day. And obviously there's a lot of people who say that there's certain miracles that happen, and you have people adamant that there are miracles that happen in the modern day, but they're not able to be captured. They're not able to be documented to the point where we're certain that they are miracles. With all the technology that we have today, why is it that we're not certain of a single miracle being an actual miracle? Why do you still need faith to believe that they're miracles rather than being able to explain them through other methods. If you do believe that the miracles continued after the death of the apostles, that's very hard to understand why these miracles can't be better understood or better documented than the documentation that we have been able to have for them. The evidence is not very strong.
Yes.
Because God loves everybody. So if a Buddhist prays in the middle of a flood to be saved, God might miraculously save her because he loves that person. He loves her.
And a lot of people attribute chance or coincidence with miracles. When you look at probability for certain things to happen, things that are very improbable, they still do happen. Like things that are very improbable, if they have a probability of occurring, they are going to occur given a certain number of iterations or given enough time. It is somewhat bothersome when people attribute improbable events happening to the supernatural or just being a miracle, because yes, something can be very improbable, but that doesn't mean it's a miracle. That means that it happens at a very low rate, but it does indeed happen sometimes, but it's not a miracle.
The problem I think that you might raise is you might say, yes, it's all fine and dandy, all fine and good. But what about these things that appear to be miracles that appear to endorse a competing theology? Yeah. So when I would look at miracle claims for a competing theology, there's two options here. One, I could say that there's a natural explanation that we're overlooking. Two, there could be a supernatural, there could be a supernatural malevolent explanation, that's demonically inspired. Now, one might say that's kind of, are you going to say everything that's not you is a demon? That's kind of a cop-out. No, I think that we can apply tests to see, is the message driving people away from, true theology about Jesus? Now, with Mormonism, I'm kind of on the fence about this one, Alex. It could be, I think there are very compelling natural explanations for many of the things you brought up. And I think some of them, there could be demonic explanations, or it could be both. Maybe it started as a hoax and the devil kind of runs with it, like in the case you gave. The case you gave, though, about the transfiguration, I mean, it sounds a lot like people could be, really, really enthralled with a religious speaker at an event. They're at essentially a rally type atmosphere where you're already religiously primed for a speaker, and they're talking about how, oh, you sound just like him.
But I feel like the same thing he's describing can be attributed to his own religion. Like, people are very enthralled in spiritual spaces of any kind and can be primed to believe certain beliefs that reinforce their religion. So his criticism of Mormonism here can be applied to his own religion.
And maybe he could give a talk at a evangelical church, and they're like, my goodness, Sean, I saw your dad Josh on stage when you were talking. It was just like him. And it's like, well, he's a lot like Josh. That's probably true. And then, it kind of, that sounds a little bit different than me than saying, yeah, my rabbi that was crucified 3 days ago and put in a tomb, we saw him. He was eating. He appeared to different groups of people. So that example I don't think is as compelling to me. The other examples, I think there's really way more disanalogous elements between.
It does sound different, but the Bible is far older, and those testimonies of him appearing physically, of Jesus appearing physically, far predate the actual writer of those books, that book, which is Paul. Paul got this information decades and decades later than it supposedly occurred, with no way of actually verifying whether or not these things did occur. But he wasn't interviewing anybody about this. The information was just passed down to him.
The resurrection claim and Mormonism, I could briefly run through them. We can unpack. Like I said, I don't want to go too on, but you threw a lot out there. Mm-hmm. So a few elements there. One, the people who saw the golden plates, that doesn't do much for me. They could have been natural artifacts. Yep. In 1843, there were people who created a hoax set of plates called the Kinderhook plates.
Yes. That
Joseph went to engage and read. So those could have been natural artifacts. It could have been hoaxes. I'm not as impressed by that. the three witnesses who saw the angel, when you look through, there's a lot of discrepancies. It seems like they had to go, and Joseph led them out there. Remember, he's already trying to convince them of this. Whereas with the apostles, all of them are starting with a blank slate. Jesus is dead. What do we do? Joseph is trying to convince these two people. One of them, Martin Harris, who is financially backing this endeavor. And so has some skin in the game on this, of this. And so they're praying, and they're praying a lot in order to see something. I think that's very different. When it comes to persecution, I'll leave on this point. I agree with you. People are willing to take risks for rewards. So Joseph Smith took a lot of risks. And I think, though, from his perspective, there were rewards he was seeking. He became a political leader in Nauvoo. He planned to run for president. He acquired multiple brides, some of them being underage, as young as 14. So we had a television show in the U.S. 20 years ago called To Catch a Predator. And I saw in that show, men were willing to take many, many, many risks for underage girls. So I'm not as surprised that he's going. And then when Smith was arrested and put in the Carthage City jail, he was not like a martyr led to the slaughter. He had a handgun smuggled into the jail, and when a gunfight broke out, he shot back. That's not quite what Jesus and the apostles.
Yeah, no, I don't think that the Mormon Church has strong foundations, and like a lot of this is more modern, and it's easier to see like the cracks in the Mormon Church because there is more, because it's so recent. You are able to see the negatives in it. You are able to see the inconsistencies in the religion a lot easier. But with older religions talking about things that happened, a couple thousand years ago, the things that are negative aren't going to be recorded. The everyday occurrences aren't going to be recorded and passed down and presented in the same way that the narrative of the religious text is presented to you. So it's very hard to point cracks in like Islam and like Christianity and Judaism when the only things that are recorded are the things that fit the religious narrative. Supernatural occurrences happen all over the world through different cultures. So it's very interesting to like look at these and really dissect why certain people believe what they believe and why they're able to get other people to believe that same thing. Human nature is something that feeds into these kinds of beliefs very well, just based on how many supernatural beliefs independent from each other exist in the world, that describe things in different ways and have their own internal logical descriptions of the world. But it was a very interesting video. I'll see you on the next one.